Hey everyone, welcome back to Life Unpotted. This is Sophie here.
And you have Daisy here as well.
Thanks for joining us today for another episode. Wherever you're tuning in, we're recording this on a Saturday afternoon. It's nice and sunny in New York City.
It's actually Sunday.
It's actually Sunday. Well, I guess I'm not keeping track of the weekend. But yeah, I'm excited to get into today's conversation because it's something that I have been personally thinking a lot about, and I think it kind of reflects where like a lot of society kind of is in the sense of like, you know, after COVID, after people having all this time with themselves, time to reflect, time to really start to question like, who am I really? Like, who do I want to be in this life? And how do I want to exist in this world? How do I want to experience this one life that I have? And I think on this topic is kind of like how we all play certain roles in society, right? We all play these roles and we get so used to playing roles of being certain people who we're not. And before you know it, you're like living your life completely far from who you really are. And like this can be something so simple as like you go to a store and, you know, you go out to society, you go to the grocery store, and the way that you interact with somebody in the store is completely different than the way that you interact with somebody at work. Like we kind of like put on these masks when we enter the society, that because we feel like we can't really be who we want to be. And on the other end of the spectrum, it could be, well, I've actually been, you know, in this corporate world, I've been not understanding my sexuality, I've been trying to be somebody I'm not. So I think the concept of roles is a very broad spectrum. It can exist in relationships, it can exist, but ultimately I think the underlying tone is like questioning the roles that we play in society, understanding why we think we need to play those roles, because ultimately what I've really been recognizing is that like as long as you're playing into a role, you're not authentic. You're not really being who you are. There's a layer separating you from, there's a layer between the role you're playing and who you really are. And that gets in the way of being vulnerable. That gets in the way of being authentic. So I think what we want to talk about today is like unraveling those roles, trying to understand those roles, trying to understand how we can live in this world free from the roles and why society wants roles. So I don't know, Daisy, what do you think about roles?
Yeah, you said a lot there. You covered a lot. I think what comes to mind first for me is that roles can be limiting because in a way you're taking one person who is playing a certain role, who's interacting with another person who is playing a role. And when you're playing a role, you put other people into roles as well. And I think especially like within the corporate sphere, I think it's like a lot of roles are played because it's kind of what gets you through work that you're not like super passionate about. It's how you convince yourself to thrive and do well. And I think it gets really messy when you start putting other people into roles in your head because you have two people who are trying to communicate, but they are in their own separate roles and putting you into a role. And none of these are actually who you really are. And I think that sounds like doesn't sound very enjoyable, right? Because it's like, it's not very fun. Like you kind of have to be, it seems serious. It seems really, really, really serious.
Well, it's like we're no longer...
And taking yourself very seriously. I think when you take yourself seriously, there's no room to make fun of yourself or like loosen up a little bit. Is kind of my take.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It's kind of like, why do we take life so seriously? I think like
roles.
When we're right, because I think we learn from such a young age. I'm trying to think like the first time I learned that to kind of play into a role. I think like honestly, it wasn't until I started working. I mean, I think that when I was younger, definitely roles of like, okay, you're in high school and you're college, you see the way people are acting around you. You know, you have the quote unquote popular group, you have the people who you're trying to be. And I think, okay, maybe I take that back. Roles were 100% in high school.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Everyone's trying to play in a who's cooler, who's not, like so artificial and so empty. But in those moments, and when I think back to high school a lot, I'm like, that was a very hard time because these roles felt so black and white. And they felt like if you weren't cool, if you weren't popular, then who were you?
I can think back to elementary school, the first time I experienced what it might be a role. So I took the test when I was like in second grade maybe to see if I would be in the higher learning, like the quote unquote smarter kids. And they're like, never mind. Like we thought she was going to place well, but she didn't. So put her back in the regular classes. And I remember I was at a track meet, and I remember the special kids that had high scores that were in the special room for special learning, higher up learning. They were going to Chicago for a special trip because they got special funding. And I remember I was at a track meet, and like my track coach dismissed them to go on this special adventure. And in my head, I recognized, oh, like they got special treatment because they're in this role of playing like the smart kids. They're better than everyone else, and they get better opportunities for that reason. And I don't know, I didn't think anything of it really, but it kind of taught me that I wasn't smart. Which I think, not that the kids were playing the role. That's kind of like a zoomed out. I think that's kind of like a role that society puts on you that teaches you what role you should be playing. So I think it's like it's really multifaceted and really complex. There's so many roles we can all be playing. And I think like that's just an example of like where a role that you're playing that you don't even know why you're playing it can start.
Yeah, and I think I think the first thing that makes me think of is how like, okay, you can have a role in the sense of I'm in this relationship and I have always been somebody who needs to be the provider. So I'm taking on the role of providing in this relationship. That's something that maybe there's a level of you assigning to yourself. I mean, the lines blur when we ask the question of, are roles based on what we're assigning, or are they based on what society's assigned? I think it's both. I think the way that we act always is based on preconceived notions, narratives, what we've grown up thinking. But what I just thought from what you were saying is like, when society assigns a role to you, that can kind of become your identity. For example, if you grew up thinking you got so much validation for always being smart and always being the kid who's good at math, or really being like really bright and intelligent, that puts so much pressure on you when you go into the world to be a certain type of person. And you enter maybe the corporate world and you're working at these jobs and you're trying to prove yourself because your whole life you were told you were so bright and you're so smart and you have to be this person in society. And then that makes it so difficult for that person to come out of that role and recognize, oh wait, maybe, I want to get in touch with this side of me that doesn't really identify with this role society attaches to somebody who is quote unquote really smart and really intelligent and who has to do all these things in the world and has to work at a prestigious company. And I just think it can be really dangerous because it takes us away from accessing certain parts of us. And the true is also true vice versa. Like in the other lens of, if you're told, oh, you didn't do well in your AP classes in high school, or you didn't get into a good college. So now I'm going to start playing the role of thinking I'm not that smart. And because society says that people who go to the better colleges, who exceed in these groups, who have better jobs, are more worthy, are smarter. And then you start limiting yourself and think, well, I can never do those other things because I have not been put into this group. Yeah. So to just sum this up, it's so interesting that like society groups us into so many specific groups, and then we attach a label to that group for the rest of our life, and then that role becomes our identity, and it gets so hard to break from that identity.
A lot of really good points there. I mean, I think now that you say all that, I feel like society is binary. It's like for there to be good, for there to be smart, there has to be bad, there has to be stupid, there has to be high achievers, there has to be lazy couch potatoes. Like it really deems people these different roles, and it really synthesizes you down to one trait that you might be experiencing in a moment because you are continuously perpetuating because that's what you were told you were. And I think like this is just half of it. I think this is kind of like what roles we learn ourselves into versus what roles we actively choose to have in our like later or like early adulthood. So I think it's important to separate those two types of roles, because I mean, I think school, like the big point, I feel like kind of like the point of like the American education system is to put you into roles, is to teach you how to be employable so you can be a working member that contributes to society, because most people have to work because that's what makes the society work the way it does. So it's detrimental, I think, because instead of like looking at everyone who is unique and interesting and has their own take on the world, it says you have 5 paths you can choose from. You have to fit into one of these paths. And I think our conversations always lead back to like, I feel like education, but it's so impressionable. It starts there. And yeah, it's where we learn to, I guess that's the beginning of how we learn to interpret society and where we fit.
So, but I think it's so interesting as we're talking about roles and as we're talking about the identities we kind of place ourselves in society. We have to remember that these were created by members of society. You know, every role that you play into, whether that is the prestigious lawyer or whether that is the policeman, like these are, whether you're a doctor, right? Like these are roles society has created, and beyond the roles, they're kind of empty. They don't, like everything in life, everything's a concept, everything is created. And when you break that apart and you peel that back, you question the origin, you say, wait, why did one person have the say in creating that? Why is that one person dictating this? But what I thought was really interesting was I was just thinking about like the dual nature in these roles, right? So the only way to have the smarter group is to have people who are stupid, who are not as smart. So in order to have people who are better than and who are more elite and more all these things, in turn, you have to have something on the opposite spectrum. For in a dualistic system, the only way that you can exist on one end, for something to hold meaning, the only way that an A in a class, the grade of an A to hold meaning, is if you have an F. Because we need things on the other side of the spectrum to give it meaning. And I think the reason why that matters is because it's just so interesting to think about, like, in order to raise and praise people of these certain groups, you have to bring someone else down, because otherwise, I don't agree with that, but the way society functions, otherwise there is no meaning in that label you're giving. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. So kind of what I was thinking was, I mean, fact check me on this. I don't know how many societies there have been, and I don't know if anyone knows exactly how many societies have risen and fallen in the time of
Rome.
The earth. Like I imagine it's thousands, if not more, of societies have existed, then fallen, and then new societies arise. And it's interesting because what society values is really subjective to the society itself, right? Say we existed 5 million years ago. I don't know what society was like then, but it's sure of a hell a lot different than what is valuable in today's society. And and that's what makes it so interesting, because it can be so flawed.
Right.
Because this one society has existed for so long. I don't even know how long our society has been around exactly, but
well, I mean, America's not even that old.
Well, I don't know what constitutes a society, but yeah, if you look at like global society or American society, like, I mean, the types of society that we have I feel like the American society has, like, it's changed and evolved, and there are people who lead that. So,
right.
And those people who lead that want you to be in a role, because then you are useful, and they tell you what you're useful for. So that's a way of control, I think. Like, not to sound extreme, but I think you have to wake up a little bit and realize that you have so much. I think it always comes back to, like, you have so much power when you connect with other human beings who are also not in a role. You have so much power when you step out of these roles and connect with other people who are not in roles. That's where true power comes from. Like, that's humanity.
So for anyone who doesn't really know what's going on, like, there's a restrict ban that is, like, potentially going to be passed. And basically what that gives is the government basically unilateral power to regulate the way we use social media. And they're calling it the TikTok ban. It's kind of a distraction because it covers all of social media. And if you use, like, a VPN, for example, it's like a $250,000 fine. And what a lot of people are talking about is kind of like how we've existed in this role as a society that there has been so much division for so long as we can remember. There are wars, right? Whether you're talking about division within a city or on a global scale, division between countries, right? And for the first time ever, there is this app, TikTok, that is allowing people to communicate, right? Like, allowing people across countries, different religions, different everything, different classes, different roles, to look at each other as human beings and have vulnerable, real conversations. And that is bridging roles. That is ripping apart roles. And I have seen so many videos of people being like, I've had real conversations. You know, I'm a Republican. I've had a real conversation with people on the other side and realized that we kind of have been attached to both these identities, and it doesn't really represent either of us. And so a lot of people, I mean, you can't say maybe this is, like, extreme to consider this, but of course, when you think about it, like, why would the government want us to break from these roles? Because the more that people break from them, the more that people are going to start being their true selves, and the more we're going to realize, oh, wait, you know, big tech actually controls everything that happens, or the government or the top percent controls what happens in the world. And people, when they start waking up and start coming out of these roles, they're like, wait, I don't like that. And I don't have to feel like, oh, wait, It's so interesting because I feel like the government or like this role of the society, they want us to be against other people because that makes us like fight, that makes us perpetuate this division. But the more we're able to talk to people across the global continents and realize that like, wow, like a lot of these roles we've been playing in our society has been created on a higher societal level by the government, and that is what creates tension. And through these like social media platforms like TikTok, where you can communicate and go, wait, oh, I actually like see you, even though you live in like a southeast country and historically we haven't gotten along. I actually see you for you as a person because I'm no longer looking at you in this small section as a role or as a group or these awful stigmas or narratives we associate with people who are in different classes. And when I'm seeing you as a human, I think the point I want to say is that of course that would lead to, if we have that would break so many systems in place in the government, that would break so many systems in place in America, in the world, and the government wouldn't want that because they don't want people to think for themselves because we've been controlled for as long as we can remember. There has been ways of being controlled by people who are higher than us.
And I think that it's so interesting. When you first hear that, you're like, oh, bullshit. Like, that's so not true. But it's kind of, it 100% is true. Like, it doesn't have to be this extreme thing. Like, I like the idea of, they say, like, you are only as good as like the closest friends in your circle that you have are. Like, you're so impressionable. Like, as humans, we are so impressionable by what our input is. So if I live in a small town in rural wherever, and I never see anyone other than people who look exactly like me, who've had the same upbringing as me, and I'm looking at the media and they're telling me what to believe, or I'm looking online and I'm only getting served people just like me through the algorithms that we have with social media in America, that's not TikTok. I'm only seeing things that it's like a very narrow world mindset. And that's to no one's fault. That's kind of, I think, consumerism. Like, we're just kind of being given all of this information and we're not necessarily choosing what we want. And I think when you take a step back and when people choose what they want, they're not going to choose these things that are being stuffed down our mouths. Like, you're going to choose to have more control. But I think there can be an overwhelming amount of like input that we're fed through the media that is so powerful, that like knows how to trigger like certain parts of us that overtake so much. And like that is a form of control. And it's like, think of certain people, like, would you let them in your living room? It's like you let so much into your living room of your home through what's on the TV. Like, you let so many ideas and information, and it's not like, media is just kind of evil, honestly, and it perpetuates these narratives and these roles and all of these things that we tell ourselves, and that is so limiting, and like no one deserves that, and no one has to live like that.
Well, I think we kind of honestly are like living in this time now, like after COVID, after everything happened, where people don't trust the news as much as we once used to. People are recognizing that like the news might be called the news, but it's not really factual information. So then you kind of go on social media and then you kind of get flooded on the other end of like everybody's kind of expressing, like, you think about like the Ohio train spill that happened, and then all of a sudden all this fear starts happening. And I think it's so easy on each ends of it, even when we're talking about the news, and if the other end we're talking about, okay, everyone sharing their own opinions on social media, you have to really be aware of like falling victim to the fear, because I think it's so easy when we're talking about like, okay, the government, you can't trust the government and all these things. How do you view that through the lens of, okay, we can be controlled, we can feel calm, we can not feel scared that, okay, potentially in 2040, what's going to happen with the presidential election? You know, people are saying that we're going to be, what were they saying that was going to happen in 2040 in America? Like
a right-wing dictatorship?
Yeah, like it would be like a dictatorship in 2040. And then it's just kind of like, let's zoom back. And I think like what is really hard is that a lot of people don't really know what to believe anymore. And when we have seen what's happened with the lack of trust that you could put into the government, people don't know where to look. People don't know where to get their information. I'm like, I don't even know where to get valid information anymore. Like, I'm not a field reporter out there. Yeah. Like, I don't really know. So I don't really know the point. I think I'm trying to say, just like to be aware that like fear can come from all angles, and
even angles that are posing to be good.
Right. Yeah. So even if like it is something on social media, you know, be aware that a lot of people, we naturally respond in fear. So like it's really hard to find the separation between fear and facts.
I think just kind of like summing up the conversation about like society and rules and the rules they put on us, I feel like it's one of those things where at the end of the day, you know what's best for yourself. And if a role doesn't fit you, it's like there's a reason why you feel like it doesn't fit. Like you don't have to play in that role. Like society maybe doesn't have your best interest at heart. It's more so to keep a functioning society. They think the best way to do that is by putting everyone into these roles.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And I think another component of it is that, well, how do we function in a society where in order to have money to pay for things, to survive, well, how do we make money to do that? And it's like a lot of the most people work for someone, and you may love your job and it may like align, it may be really great, but a lot of people are just doing their job for money. And then how do you justify 40, 50 hours of your week doing something just for money? Well, you start to play into the role because at least it's satisfying. And I think that's just, I don't know, that's just like kind of sad to me. Like that's what we have to do. Like it's kind of like that's the way of survival is doing that. And I feel like it's like detaching from a part of yourself. And so many people have to do that in order to make the best of the situation.
Yeah.
So what's that? Like, tell me what you think about that of like, to make the best of the situation you fit into a role. Is there a way to make the best of a situation with a job you hate by not playing the role? Roles are something we're always going to play. Roles aren't bad. But I think what's important is knowing the separation and not taking the role so seriously. Being able to go into a role and come out of it.
Well, I think that's the question of like, why does everyone take life so seriously? And I think it's because we are trying so hard to uphold these roles that we think we need to be. Like, whether you're at the workplace or whether you're interacting with society, it's like, why can't we just be ourselves? Because isn't that what everyone wants? Like, just to be themselves? And it's like, but there's so much fear there but I think what we need to recognize is like, the more that we're able to break from these roles and like be who we really are, the more that you give permission to the next person who you're interacting with to be themselves. Because I've seen this happen a lot, and I think it's like the example of like everybody's kind of like waiting for watching the next person's move. We're all kind of waiting like to see what the next person does, right? Like it's like, okay, how is this person responding? And it's like for example, right? You go to a party and you're like you want to see like right, you're in a role, you're either like really stiff. And I was reading in the New Earth book. He's talking about like when you're in a social setting, you can kind of recognize the people who are more caught up in their thoughts, caught up in their mind, the ones who are thinking about themselves, because the ones that are the more stiff and they're not having as good of a time. And I think what he was saying in the book is that like a lot of those people are caught up thinking about themselves, right? They're caught up so worried about how people are going to perceive me. And like you're in a social setting and you're looking to everyone else to see how is this person acting, because you're so scared to deviate from what everyone else is doing. Like it just goes back to how we are we're so scared of deviating from the norm. We're so scared to be different than people around us. And I think, but what we don't recognize is that like the more you give yourself permission to deviate from the norm, the more that people around you look at you and go, oh, wait, this role I've been living in, this even an example in such a situation, it's like this role I've been living in, I don't need to be so rigid. I don't need to take myself so seriously, because that was just a concept and that was just a narrative that I have adapted and taken on through my life based on what I thought I need, based on the way I thought I need to act in society. And when you see somebody else kind of like being more themselves and like loosening up a little bit, the first response could be like, oh, that's kind of weird. Like, why do you feel comfortable? And I think it's so interesting, like when we see other people be comfortable sometimes, we're kind of like, ugh, like that looks weird. Like, why are you so happy?
So let me ask, are you equating that the more comfortable you are with yourself, the less likely you feel like you need to play a role because you don't need to rely on that as much to become uncomfortable, or you don't have to rely on that as much, versus the more insecure, the more in your head you are, you look to a role and you're like, okay, like I don't have to work through like my anxiety and all of these things, that my insecurities, and I can just rely on this role as a crutch.
Yeah, because I think when you're
to not go deep.
So this is interesting because I think that like when you have agreed to play a certain role your whole life, there's a level of certainty that role gives you. And I think that's why we cling to, okay, for example, like you're a doctor, right? And You've taken on the role of being a doctor, even though you don't really want to do that, but that gives you comfort because that gives you certainty. You can operate in the world and tell people, oh, this is the job I'm doing. I like that. You can go to work. It allows you to not have to face.
It's very acceptable.
Right. And it allows you to not have to face that discomfort that comes from recognizing that, oh, wait.
You're more than that.
I don't want to be that. And I'm actually not that. But then if I stop identifying with this role, who will I be? Because we look to so much of our identity from the roles we play in society, and we are so scared to not have purpose, to not have identity.
That is really interesting.
Right? And then I think the more you peel back apart, you realize that people so naturally cling so much to these certain roles of being certain people in the world because we are so scared to face who would we be without this? Who would we be if we didn't have this label to attach onto? If I didn't consider myself a certain type of person, if I was to remove and strip everything back, then that's scary to think about. What would I find and how would I operate in this world? Because there would be so much uncertainty that comes with that.
Wow. Yeah.
Good point.
That's a good. That's so true, because it's easier to fall into like this place, like especially like in American society, like we ask you like, what do you do? Like we equate like what you do for work as who you are. And for a lot of people, like that like you said, it's easier, it's acceptable. You don't have to go deeper. Like you find all your meaning from that. And I do think it's great to find meaning from your job. Like it's really, really great. Like you want that. But what you're saying is you don't want to over identify with it, because what if you lose that job? What if something happens where you can no longer perform that job? You're going to freak out. Because that's all you know. That's how you see who you are.
And your identity is being threatened.
Yeah.
So much of the
way, like I think the relief is that you don't have to be anything. You can be something while also not being anything.
Right. And I think the reason why we're really scared from a lot of things in life, because we're so scared of our identity being threatened. We're so scared of this story that we have created our whole life of being threatened, because if that's gone, then who are we really?
I think I was wrong. Like I think I came off wrong in the beginning of the episode where I was like demonizing roles, because roles are important. But I think what's dangerous is over identifying with roles isolated from like not being able to bring who you are into the role. Because there's a lot of experiences like you want the doctor to play the doctor role, but you don't want the doctor to play the doctor role like when they're over identifying with the role. Right. I think it's over identification with the role versus just showing up as the role, but like also knowing that it's just a role. Like there's separation between you, who you are as a person, and then the role that you play.
Right.
In some professions, you require more of a role, but you don't have to over-identify with it. Like you can be more humanized in that role. So it's interesting. There's two different types of roles.
Well, I think I'm less concerned about like the doctor playing the role versus like the person who convinces themselves that they have to work in corporate America their whole life because that is what their parents told them and that's what they've been reflected back to them, and then they don't give themselves a chance to deviate from that. Mm-hmm. And right. I think what I wanted to say...
when the role especially doesn't fit.
Right. And what I wanted to say, based on what I was saying earlier, is just kind of like when we create an identity that we have spent much of our life attaching to, when we spend much of our life being attached to a certain story or a certain role, we would rather stay in that identity than deal with the discomfort that comes from questioning it. And what I've really experienced in my personal life is just like, it can be really scary and really hard to say, wait, I don't think I'm actually who I think I am. I don't think I actually am this role I've been playing in my life. Mm-hmm. And I think that situation, you have one or two options. You kind of, I mean, it's not black and white. It's not so simple like that, but you kind of stop and you think, you're like, okay, I can either continue this route. I can either continue living this life that, you know, I don't really love that much, but you know what? It's safe and it's comfortable familiar. And it's familiar, and we love familiarity mm-hmm. because that is familiar and that's safe. We view that as safety. Mm-hmm. And or I can go down the other route of questioning and being like, wait a minute, who am I really? And like questioning it and being like, who am I really? And realizing I don't have to live that way.
Totally. I mean,
I think I just want to make something really clear that I really learned in my experience. When you start questioning your identity, when you start questioning who you really are, there's this huge cloud of fear that comes over you, right? And I think it's easy to mistake that fear to mean that there's no other way to live. That, oh, well, when I think about leaving my job, or when I think about breaking up with this person, or I think about, just finally tapping into who I really want to be, that sounds so scary. So that life must be really hard. But what I think is so easy to forget in that moment, it's like, it's not necessarily that life's going to be really hard. It's that life is just not familiar. And we associate lack of familiarity with difficulty. And yes, of course, there is a level of discomfort that comes from, finding your way into who you really are. But it's like, and I say this all the time, it's like, just because something's it's just like living a comfortable life, living an easy life is not necessarily what's going to make you happy.
Well, you're gonna I hate to be morbid, but you're gonna die either way.
Yeah.
Well, despite which route you take. And what I was gonna say was that, like, I kind of had this like freak out a little bit of like in my head freak out last night, because I'm doing this right now. Like, I've worked in quote unquote corporate America for the past 5 years, and every time I would leave a job, I'd be like, I don't want to get another job just like this one. I'm gonna try to like veer off, but I would just end up in another job that I didn't want to be in, because I thought, I have to prove myself this way. This is like, I'm in debt, not like literally, but I'm indebted to what society told me I have to do, and like, to be a good member of society, I have to do things I don't want to do, and I always push that away. And I think I finally got to the place where I'm like, you know what, I'm not getting younger, time's not slowing down, it's speeding up, and I have to leave my job. So after 2.5 years, I did leave my job, and this couple of days ago, and I'm going to work at a cafe, and I'm studying nutrition, because that's just what I know I have to do. And it doesn't make sense to me, but like, it's really scary to be like, oh my God, what am I doing? But when I look in hindsight, I'm like, what I was doing wasn't going anywhere. It was just comfortable. And when I think about how like life is long, and like, where will I be in 40 years? That's a lot of time. I can imagine doing something I hate for 40 years. So that's scarier at the end of the day than taking my life into my own hands and deciding what path I take and taking the risk now. Like, you can always go back to that. And I think just the reason I brought this up is because the detaching of an identity, even one that you don't like, that plays a huge role in your life. You're working 40 hours a week, even one that you don't like, it can still provide some sort of comfort, because it gives you purpose without much effort.
Right.
But that's also dangerous, because that can end up killing you more quickly than taking the risk of what feels so uncomfortable to detach from any sort of identity and create your own. And like, that's what I'm doing right now. And it's scary, but it's also like, I feel like alive. I feel like I'm like, wow, I'm doing this for myself, and no one else is supervising me. And that is so empowering. And I think that allows you to connect with your voice.
Totally. Because ultimately the goal out of all of this is that like, we deserve to live a life where we're really identifying with who we really are. And I think the roles that we play in society make it difficult for us to figure out who we are, because we don't know anything otherwise. And just because you haven't experienced that side or that identity, it's giving yourself a chance to explore that without being rigid, without taking life so seriously, and realizing that like, what is there really to lose?
Well, it's like life's a dance. And I feel like I've heard that quote so many times, and I didn't really understand it until last night, because there's nowhere to get. You're not promised you're going to get anywhere. You're not promised you're going to even exist for a period of time. If you want to do something now, and you can, get rid of your limiting beliefs and do it, because you have to remember to enjoy the moment.
Yeah.
Like, and I think that it's a really hard lesson to learn, because the society we're brought up in, we become our own biggest critic because of what we deem is unacceptable. So we become our own gatekeepers on what we are and aren't able to do that actually isn't our voice.
And then we end up spending our whole life fighting against ourselves, because there comes to a certain point. So I think it's really important to mention about this whole conversation about roles. There comes to a certain point where society isn't even really telling you anymore. Maybe that was something you were told when you were younger. Maybe that was something in college or in high school that you started to adapt this certain sense of identity of who you have to be. But at the end of the day, like, as you're in your 20s and getting older, no one's really telling you what to do. And I think we lose that sense of freedom of recognizing that, wait, we are the ones who are just locking ourselves into this box. We are the only ones who are limiting ourselves. We are the ones who are perpetuating this identity. It's no one else. It's not even society anymore. I mean, obviously there is always a pressure from society, but it's like we have the control to decide of like, do we want to keep living a life a certain way or not? And it's not so simple, and that requires a lot of hard work, and that requires a lot of self-reflection, but it's on you. And the pressure from society will always be there, but the more you work through this, the more that the external noise starts to go away, and you're like, wait, the more I can break from this identity I've been living in my whole life, the more clarity I will get, and the more weight that lifts off my shoulder, and the more clarity I will get, and the more that I can really appreciate this life. So I just think it's important to wrap up this conversation kind of, it's just like making the point that like, yes, while society definitely does instill a lot of pressure for the way we have to act, for the way we feel like we need to conform to social norms, to roles, ultimately, it is up to us to break that cycle. Ultimately, it is up to us to decide that we don't want to play that role anymore. And the more that we're able to break that cycle, the more that the people in our lives will also see that, and the domino effect will ensue, and collectively, the collective society will start to realize, oh wait, if no one else is, because think about it, if you're not pretending to be somebody else, if you're not playing into this role, then the other person perceiving you won't feel like they had to play into a role, because the only reason we feel like we have to play into a role is because the people who we're interacting with are then in a role, and you have two people who are just in roles. But when one breaks that, you realize this weird thing starts to happen of people who are really themselves. You're like, wait, I can let go, and I don't have to pretend anymore. Because that person is now giving me the validation. So it's the importance of like showing the world who you really are, because that is a power, and that is a power that will help people and help the society get closer and closer to just kind of living to who we really are.
Because isn't that the point of life? Something deep like that. We could do a part 2 on this.
There's a lot to say.
We could do a part 2 on this.
I mean, I think there's a lot to say about this, and I don't know if the conversation was all over the place, but I just think that like, there are so many, it's so multifaceted. Like we can go more in depth about like, okay, when you're in a social setting, why is it awkward? Why do I feel a certain way? Like we can go into literally each role and dissect them. I think this is like a broader overview of just kind of like the roles in society and the ways that we have to decide if we're going to break from them or not.
Yeah. We could do a whole episode on like personal relationships and roles.
Oh, social anxiety. We should definitely do an episode on that.
One like that, but also even talking about like, as you move through life, you move through different roles, and how like your relationships change with different people in your life, and that's
uncomfortable. I know, write that down.
That's probably like one of the most difficult. So I think that we probably will do a lot more episodes on this topic. I think it's a really powerful one.
You wrap it up this year? I guess I kind of already did.
I think you already wrapped it up. I think that we're just gonna leave you with thinking about this, because we're gonna continue to talk about it. So if there's any other takes on roles you would like us to talk about, write us. You know where to find us on Instagram. Also,
there's a new thing now where you can leave voice messages on Spotify, I think. So if anyone wants to write us in with a voice message of things they're experiencing or anything, feel free to do that. Because we want to get involved. And the point of this podcast is to connect and grow a community and to build a community.
100%.
I want to say it again because I want to get the video of it. So I think the point of this podcast is to grow a community with like-minded people who are also trying to figure out what does it mean to experience this life? What does it mean to exist in this world where there's so much pressure? How do I become who I am? How do I navigate that? And I think the more we're surrounded by people who are trying to do that, the more validation we get, the more comfort we get into being ourselves.
100%.
And that's the point of this podcast.
100%.
It's our journey.
Yeah.
But we are sharing our journey so that other people can feel like they have the permission to also experience that journey.
What journey?
The journey of becoming who they really are.
You mean the dance?
The dance. All right. It's not a journey. It's not a journey. It's a dance. But
so if you like this episode,
that's an Alan Watts quote, by the way, if anyone was wondering.
As always, please review, leave us 5 stars. Write a review on Apple Podcasts.
Well, don't leave 5 stars if you don't like it.
Only if you like it.
Be honest.
Yeah, be honest. We want to hear your feedback. And don't forget to look out for our weekly blog post. We have one coming out Monday. So this will be releasing on Tuesday. So it'll already have been out for this week. So don't forget to look at that. You can find a link down below in our show notes. And we'll be here next Tuesday talking about the same stuff.
We'll be here for like 600 million more Tuesdays because I don't really foresee myself wanting to stop doing this.
No, definitely not. And we just want to connect with all of you. So please, please, please reach out to us and share this with your friends and with your family.
And eventually we want to start doing in-person events. So that is on the radar. That is in the trajectory. We're moving to Austin, Texas in September. So excited about that. And yeah.
So if you know anyone in Austin, Texas, send them our podcast.
Yeah.
If you like it.
All right, y'all. Thanks for listening. And as always, we'll talk to you next week. Okay. Enjoy the rest of your week and day.
See you next week.